80% of dentists right now are undervaluing what their practice is worth. It used to be that you could just slap a number on it and be like, oh, well, I'm going to sell my practice for 70 to 80% of my collections. Well, that's not how it works anymore.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Raving Patients Podcast. I first want to thank both of my sponsors, both Dental Intelligence and the Doc Site, for their support, allowing me to come to your inbox every Friday morning, 5 a.m. Eastern time. And I know some of you do listen because you tell me you listen right when it comes out. So I appreciate their support. I also want to inform everybody about an event in September in Scottsdale, Arizona at the Scott Resort and Spa. It's called Supercharge Your Dental Practice. It's superchargeyourdentalpractice.com. You can save $100 on registration. We have 13 amazing speakers to talk about business, marketing, leadership, and the money part of the business. So please check it out. Please come. Let me know if you need any additional information, but I look forward to having my second annual event in Scottsdale, September 27th and 28th. My guest is Michelle Hedgecock from Connect The Dents, and we're going to be talking about things like what is EBITDA, because there's a lot of confusion about what EBITDA is. When should doctors consider leaving their practice? When is the best time to consider selling? We're discussing selling to individual docs, which I did, versus DSOs versus DPOs. So there's a lot of different topics. If you are at the point in your career that you're considering potentially selling, you want to raise the volume and listen up. She's currently a business development associate with Connect The Dents, performing practice valuations and helping guide doctors in determining the best avenues and timings for selling their business. She's also a clinical researcher for Vigilant Biosciences and an early detection device for oral cancer. Michelle, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me today. I'm really looking forward to our discussion.
So we go way back. You are a long-time Bird Eye user. We know each other for a really long time. Unfortunately, you had to medically retire from clinical practice. Not too long ago, you had to sell your practice, which was a startup at that point, or a newer startup. And you now are transitioning to the next phase of your career, which is starting with the oral cancer stuff, but also working for Tony at Connect The Dents, helping practices or helping dentists decide on their future and helping them sell their practice. So expand on your bio a little bit, talk about your background, why you decided to go into this round of this sector of business after giving up your handpiece and no longer practicing clinically.
Sure. So one of the things I really wanted to do was stay in the field of dentistry. My passion was always patients, but after kind of what happened to me and what I went through, I realized that doctors really are not educated when it comes to when to sell and how to be prepared for it, because I was not prepared. I never in a million years imagined I would be retiring at 42 years old. But it came on pretty sudden. And at that point in time, I was not financially prepared for that. And I also didn't even know where to start. So I just assumed that my only route was to hire a broker. And typically they're going to take, 6 to 10% off the top when you sell your practice. And they didn't do a valuation. I had no idea what the purpose of it was and how to even determine the value of my practice. And so it kind of got me set down this path. I actually met Tony Stefanu. He's the owner of Connect The Dents. When I was going through the process, he helped me out. And after I sold my practice, I was like, you know what? He helped me out without any, he kind of just went over and above for me and without any expectations. And I was really grateful for that. And I want to give back in the same way. So here I am. I'm kind of a partner with Tony now and trying to help him grow and expand into teaching more dentists where they should look when they're ready to sell.
I was fortunate because I sold to my associate. I had already moved to Florida. I was not a candidate for a DSO sale because they want you to stay on. And so I knew I had to sell privately, and had it on the market for a while. Finally, my associate ended up deciding she wanted to buy the practice, which was the easiest thing for me. I didn't have to pay a broker fee. I didn't have to do anything. It was an easy transition, and the team already knew her. So the patients had started to know her. So I actually exited very gracefully and was more than happy to hand over the keys to the practice. And I recently sold the building to her. So I'm not involved in the building at all anymore. So I have no connection to the practice anymore. And I did it in a way I thought was really good. But there are a lot of people who can't do that. Unfortunately, you had a medical problem and you had to retire. A lot of people are deciding, hey, I have other income. I have other ways to make money similar to me. I want to get out. So let's talk about a lot of those things. So one of the big misunderstood in a lot of cases, especially for solo practitioners, is the term EBITDA. Can you talk about what EBITDA is and how is fair market determined based on EBITDA dollars? EBITDA didn't come into my sale at all. It was simply how much revenue to do on average over the 3 years, and she paid a percentage of it, and that was the end of that. But that's not the way a lot of companies look at it now. So can you discuss EBITDA and how is fair market value determined?
Yeah, sure. So one of the things I want to point out is that most dentists, like 80% of dentists right now, are undervaluing what their practice is worth. And it's because a lot of things come into play. It used to be that you could just slap a number on it and be like, oh, well, I'm going to sell my practice for, 70 to 80% of my collections. Well, that's not how it works anymore. So EBITDA is an accounting number, and it's basically earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. But what it really means is when we're looking at a practice, what is the true adjusted cash flow in the practice? So, we have a lot of expenses in dental that are truly dental expenses, but let's be real, it's a business. So we've all got, we're paying for our car, we're paying for CE, we're paying for our family, whatever. We don't have to go into all of that, but there's a lot of things that we're paying for that, let's just say a DSO is going to come in, or maybe even another individual doctor, that those expenses are not going to transfer over. So those expenses will be taken out, and then we basically get an adjusted cash flow, and then the EBITDA and the fair market value is determined from taking that number and assuming 0% growth over that first year. And that's how we determine what that buyer's profit line would be during that first year. So that's how that value is determined.
When people go to resell or sell their practice, where are you seeing the numbers with EBITDA transfer compared to, the old way, which is based on a percentage of collections, which is not the way to evaluate a practice? So can you compare those two, and generally where practices, what potential buyers are paying on EBITDA now versus a percentage of collections?
So one of the things I want to point out is that you could have two practices within right next to each other that are collecting $1 million. Okay. So let's say one practice is collecting $1 million, but they're all fee for service, and it's a really long-term existing practice. They've got a big pool of patients that are staying on, have been there forever. They, have a lot of technology. That could be totally different from the practice next door that's producing $1 million, that's outdated. They're on a lot of PPO plans. They're maybe taking Medicare. It's kind of like more of a quick turn. Those practices are not going to be worth the same amount of money. And I'll talk about that a little bit later, and how we do our valuations a little bit different than maybe if you were to hire your accountant to do it. But in general, the EBITDA is used for determining a baseline, amount of profit for that first year. What we saw in the past, especially 2021, 2022, was just an astronomical injection of PE money into dental practices and the dental industry, period. Products, services, all of that stuff. And so a lot of these companies came in and just started just buying up all these dental practices, and they were paying, just asinine multiples on these EBITDAs. It's kind of settled down a little bit, with interest rates and inflation and everything that's happened over the last year and a half or so. So those multiples have gone down. But what we've also seen is that a lot of these companies that just threw money in and they didn't know what they were doing, some of these are going under. And so there needed to be this kind of level out in the market to where, we're kind of seeing now that the multiples that are getting paid are pretty reasonable. So if you were to sell to an individual doctor, you're typically going to get a lower EBITDA. And the reason is because that doctor doesn't have group buying power like these big DSOs have. Their expenses as an individual doctor are going to be a lot higher than it would from a group practice. And so whenever we do the valuations, we actually give you two separate values. One, if you were to sell to an individual doctor versus selling to a group.
Got it. No, that makes a lot of sense. So let's transition a little bit of the conversation. And when do you think doctors should consider having their practice evaluated or evaluated? Because obviously it's dependent on a lot of different things. You don't necessarily have to be close to your retirement or selling to be able to do that. But at what point in someone's career do you recommend that they do have the evaluation done so they know where their numbers stand?
There's a lot of situations, but one thing I want to say is most dentists are selling their practice 3 to 5 years too late. So you really need to be selling or looking at selling when you are at your peak. At some point, you're going to plateau and then you're going to start going down. So, a 5% decrease in your revenue over a year's time frame is not going to be a linear 5% decrease in the value. It's exponential decrease in the value of your practice. So, just getting a baseline for sure. But a lot of these doctors are getting approached by DSOs, especially these bigger practices, and they're just getting numbers thrown at them. And there's no way they're going to know whether or not they're actually truly getting what their practice is worth. So that's definitely a time that you want to make sure that you're getting a third party valuation so that, you're not just going off of what this offer is that just came in off the streets. If you're going to be hiring an associate who may eventually be buying in at some point, it's really good idea to have a baseline because obviously if it's 5 years later and the associate has contributed to the growth of the practice, there's going to be a discussion on what the practice is truly worth and how much they've actually put into that. And that's really hard to kind of backtrack on. So having an appraisal and then setting an agreement ahead of time, obviously using legal help with that, but setting an agreement for how the transition is going to look when that does occur. There's a lot of partnerships happening where individual doctors are joining forces and becoming, a group of practices. We recommend that each individual practice gets evaluated before that transaction occurs. Obviously, life changes. If you're experience a downturn in your health and you're thinking you may have to retire soon, if you think you may be going through a divorce soon, or, if you're going to have to relocate at some point in the near future, those are all times when you really don't want to get your practice valuated right before you leave. Because ideally, we're taking this valuation and we're looking at the different areas of the practice where you may be able to increase your EBITDA. And without getting a valuation done, you really don't know where those are because it's not based on new patient numbers and how many of crowns did I do and all the things that we're used to looking at when we're working with consultants and things like that to try to increase the, production of the practice. That doesn't always increase your EBITDA.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And that happened to myself. And I don't really tell this that often, but in 2010, 11, and 12 were my heydays in the practice. So a long time ago, I was doing $2.4 million was my top line revenue working 3.5 days a week. What I didn't realize was that, because I did get approached about selling, but I was too young. I felt I was too young, I should say. So I chose not to even look into doing it. But then I got involved in the marketing side of things. I got involved with reviews, joined Bird Eye. And then literally from that point on, my practice started to decrease and decrease and decrease. And then I started working only 2 days a week, Mondays and Tuesdays. And my practice decreased even further. Then we brought an associate in. At that point, when I took 2 days, she started taking insurance. It affected the bottom number. So I did not do things the way I should have. Looking back, I probably should have sold when I was at my heyday, when I was at my top, which would have been a lot different in how much money I got from it. But again, you live and learn. You don't make the same mistake a second time. But yes, I recommend you definitely do it earlier. If you bring in an associate who has any opportunity or any willingness to buy your practice, get it evaluated then. Because if not, you're going to be fighting about what the practice is worth, because if you don't evaluate it then, how much are you putting in for the work that they did over those 2, 3, 4, or 5 years? So I agree 100% with what you had just said, and I lived that personally. So 100% so. So you talked about potentially now. When is the best time to consider selling though? Obviously there's a lot of factors that are going involved. You were forced to sell. I sold because I wanted to. Some people get to an age where they can't practice anymore, but there are so many variables here. When is the best time for someone to consider selling their practice?
Obviously, it's at that peak time, but I think it really depends on what your goals are. So, I didn't have a choice. I couldn't stay on. But for a lot of doctors, and what I'm learning now that I'm working in this field is there's so many different setups with these DPOs and the DSOs where you can have as much or as little kind of involvement in the day-to-day of the practice as you want. I mean, I met a doctor the other day that's working with a DPO that is on disability. He partnered with them for his practice. He's only working 6 days a month. And it's just enough to stay under that level where he needs to be at to stay on disability. But because he's still the clinical leader of the practice, he's the leader of the team. He's kind of, just there that time and like helping kind of manage things from the doctor clinical side of things, that he still now owns a huge percentage of that practice. So he's participating in the growth of the practice. He wasn't forced completely into retirement through the disability, and being able to partner with somebody like that gave him the opportunity to continue practicing and continue growing in that investment portion of what your practice is. So let's be real, it's a retirement plan. So
it is definitely a retirement plan. So
yeah.
How can you increase the fair market value of your practice?
There is a misconception that like buying a bunch of new fancy equipment is going to increase the value. That's not necessarily going to be the case. Ideally, what you're wanting to do is increase your collections and decrease your expenses. So one of the things that we see most commonly is that a lot of doctors are not doing annual increases on their fees. So unfortunately, when you're not doing that, especially in a high inflation environment where, you're paying an extra $3 for a sandwich, you've got to increase your prices too. The cost of labor has gone up, the cost of supplies has gone up, the cost of the cost of everything has gone up. And what we're seeing is the doctors are just taking home less money, right? So as the expenses go up, if you don't increase your collections, your EBITDA is going to go down. So, obviously, new patient flow is very important. So making sure that you're focusing on bringing new patients in, retaining your current patients, that's really important as well. One of the other misconceptions that I've seen, there's this push for these individual doctors to go straight fee for service, which for me, that's what I wanted. I didn't want to be involved with a bunch of insurance plans and PPOs, but depending on who your ideal seller is going to be to, you don't necessarily want to be all fee for service, because a lot of times these DPOs and the DSOs, when they come in, they have way better negotiated fees because they're a group. So that's an automatic, immediate increase in their profitability because they have higher fees that they're getting paid from these insurance companies than you were. You can't do that if you're all fee for service, right? Because you're not dependent on the in-network fees from the insurances. So there's a lot of things depending on who you're going to sell with. Now, I will say, there's not a lot of DSOs that will buy smaller practices. And by a smaller practice, I mean really less than $1 million. I have talked to some that are okay, maybe with more than 800,000 in collections. But really we're kind of that $1 million mark. But then the other side of the coin is you start getting to these really high value practices. These individual doctors can't get loans for these. So you may not even have the option to go that route. And your only route may be to go to looking at DSOs and DPOs.
Yeah, it's interesting because I was a fee-for-service practice. I did not take insurance. And it was very difficult to find a buyer other than my associate. Even though my numbers were really good, they felt that when the doctor leaves, that's why they're coming. They're going to lose patients when they bring someone else in. So fee-for-service is great, but when it comes to selling, it's not as great as you think it's going to be. So that's 100% an issue there.
And that is something that I was not aware of. I always thought everybody's going to want to buy a fee-for-service practice. But once I learned a little bit more about it and kind of like thought it through, it makes total sense.
I agree 100% with that. So, but I was glad I was able to stay fee for service throughout my career simply because it makes life easier to manage. You don't have to deal with the insurance companies. You don't have to deal with the patients. You don't have to deal with the low fee schedules. So there's a lot of freedom with that. When it comes to selling, you have some barriers though. So, and I agree that, and a DSO is not going to be interested in a practice that's under $1 million in most cases, unless they know they can grow it significantly and they buy a cheap practice to make it worth a couple $1 million after a couple of years. But in general, they're not looking at the mid-size. They're looking at strong practices that do over $1 million.
And let me throw another little piece in there, because one of the things that we're finding that is, well, number one, if you're going to sell to a DSO or a DPO, you can't leave. So you've got to stay on. There's no choice. A lot of the DSOs require at least a 2-year commitment. A lot of the DPOs, it's 5 years minimum commitment. So the DPOs, because it's more of a partnership, you're partnering with them, right? Like you're partnering to grow your practice. And eventually when you sell your portion of that the idea is that piece is going to be worth a lot more later on down the road. So. Yeah,
100% agree with you. So let's talk about, and again, we talked about this briefly. Let's talk about selling to an associate or a private sale as private doctor versus a DSO versus a DPO. There are some differences. As you mentioned, if you sell to a DSO, they're not going to want you to leave. I was not a candidate for a DSO because I already moved to Florida. So that was not happening. So I knew that I was not DSO material, even though they had some interest. I just wasn't staying on. But can you talk about some of the differences between selling to a private sale, selling to a DSO versus a DPO?
Sure. Yeah, so one of the biggest differences in selling to a private sale is obviously the staying on. Sometimes an individual doctor is going to want you to stay for a transition period. Sometimes they just want like a clean break. Like, it's my practice now. I'm going to run it how I want to. So that's definitely a big piece of it. Like, are you ready to fully retire, or do you want to keep continuing to grow? Do you want to partner with somebody? That's always an option for an individual buyer as well. One of the things to consider with that is that if you have a bigger practice, more than $1 million, to just keep in mind that selling to an individual doctor is going to give you less money for your practice. But also, typically when you do these individual sales, you are having to go through a broker. And that's going to take that big chunk off the top as well. But some practices, having an individual doctor is the ideal scenario. And sometimes you don't have a choice. So as far as the DSO versus a DSO is a dental service organization. Some of the bigger ones like Heartland, Aspen Dental, those types of companies typically, and they're all structured very differently. Let me start with that. So I've seen all kinds of levels of, how much cash are they going to give you at close? How long are they going to expect you to stay on? Are they going to want to hire an associate? Are you able to take more time off? How much of the HR part of things are they going to take over for you? Do you want to be still involved in that? Or do you just want to be done with it? Do you want to be involved in the hiring and firing? Do you want to completely not have to deal with that? But one of the other big pieces that we're seeing in the DSOs is a holdback. So basically they keep a certain percentage. We're usually seeing it's usually around 20%, but they're all different, where they're holding back this amount of money, and you basically have to keep your production level to be able to earn that. Now, they're fair with it. So like if you don't meet your goal, this quarter, if you do meet it next quarter, they'll back pay you kind of thing. So they're not trying to rip you off. It's just more kind of incentive to keep the practice going at the level that it was at. And they're not even most of the time necessarily asking for even a percentage of growth. It's just, they don't want you to just stop trying, basically. Yep. So there is that. And then they also typically will give you some shares in the company. Both DSOs and DPOs will do what's called a recap. And not all of them, because I have met some DPOs that are not planning to, and some DSOs as well that don't even have that in their projections. But most of the time, the DSOs are going to be on a 5-year schedule, where every 5 years they're taking that whole DSO and they're selling it to private equity. And at that point in time, you can get, your shares back paid to you. And then sometimes you can stay in, sometimes that's kind of the end of it. The risk I see with that, and there's positives and negatives to all of this, but the risk I do see with that is that, number one, you don't know how much the company is going to be worth at that point in time. You need to make sure that you're going with a reputable company, that they're not just throwing a bunch of money at practices. And if you're looking at it and they're already 4 years into their recap, you're not going to get as much return on it. Whereas if you were one of the early doctors that came in on that initial start to that DSO. But then you also have to keep in mind that when a new PE firm comes in, there's going to be changes. So even though you signed up for, having your practice run this certain way, that doesn't mean that that's what's going to happen at that recap mark. So with the DPOs, it's a little bit different because they're not buying 100% of your practice. They're typically going to buy a majority of your practice, but not necessarily all of it. So they'll let you still have a certain percentage of ownership in the practice so that whenever you're ready, typically minimum of 5 years, you're allowed to sell your shares in the practice or in the business if you want to. Typically, the longer you hang on, the longer you work for them, the higher the multiples are going to be, the more growth there's going to be because they are investing, as they're a partner, they are investing into your practice to help grow the practice. One of the other cool things that I have seen with some of the DPOs, and there may be some DSOs that do this, but I haven't talked to any yet, but some of the DPOs, they do profit sharing. So your office, because you are still partial owner, you're going to get to share in those profits of the office individually. And then a lot of times they'll also give you shares in the company profits as well. So like dividends kind of thing. So you're not only getting that recap investment money back, but you're also getting kind of like being able to dip from multiple buckets.
Got it. And last question I have is how does Connect the Dents work when it comes to their matching program?
Yeah, so we're very different in that we're doctor focused. We're trying to do what's best for the doctor. So if you come in and you do a valuation with us and we determine kind of what route is best for you to go, whether you should sell to an individual versus a group organization. If you're going to sell to an individual, we do not do doctor to doctor transactions. So we have some really great brokers that we work with, and we'll match you with a broker depending on what you need and your location. If you are a candidate to sell to a group organization, at that time, we will enter you into our matching program, and we have agreements with hundreds of DSOs at this point and DPOs, where we have a really in-depth questionnaire that we give them of all their offerings and how they function and how they work. We get to know them really well. So based on what the doctor is looking for, do you want equity, or how long are you staying on? Is your team staying on? Do you have room to expand? What's your location? Making sure that it's a good fit to where your practice is going to benefit from having that investment from the outside world, but also that you're going to be happy in the decision that you made and the group that you're working for. So from what you tell us you want, we'll go in and actually match you with a group that we feel is a good fit for you. And then you have 30 days to kind of date each other and figure out, hey, is this a good fit? And it's got to be a good fit on both sides. A lot of these companies place high value on culture. And so making sure that you agree in culture and the way that the companies run and all the things that you want and expect. And then if you agree that it's a fit, and LOI is typically given, and 98% of the time they're agreeing to the fair market value that we've set for these practices. So it's going to be like, here's kind of the baseline minimum that you should get for your practice.
Got it. Well, that's great. We'll get your contact information so people can reach out to you if they have interest in learning more about how Connect the Dents can help. So we're going to transition as we have a few minutes left. I'm going to do my lightning round Q&A as I explained. We're going to read some questions to you. They're all business related questions. Just answer them very quickly. What is the number one tactic that you use to stay organized?
Oh my gosh, I shouldn't say Post-it notes.
Hey, it works for some people.
I do.
Do you make a to-do list every day, weekly? When do you make one?
I make a to-do list every day. And it's kind of order of importance. So that Post-it gets thrown away once I'm done with it.
Nothing wrong with that. What book have you read multiple times, or what book is your favorite and you recommend other people read as well?
How to Win Friends and Influence People.
Very popular choice in my podcast. So, what has been one of your most satisfying moments in business throughout your entire career?
I don't know that it was with business, but I think probably one of the most satisfying things for me was when I was teaching other doctors. So there's something about being on the same kind of mental level with somebody and being able to be colleagues and feel like you're helping. I really enjoyed that a lot.
Well, it's educating. There's definitely a thrill when you educate and you're up on stage and people are thanking you and telling you how great you did. That's a thrill that you can't describe either. I understand that completely. What is one skill or trait you feel is imperative to be successful?
Drive, for sure. Staying consistent with your goals and continuing to drive towards what you desire.
Got it. Who has been your greatest inspiration?
God.
Nothing wrong with God. That's a popular choice as well. So this is a tough question and it's very difficult for some people, but I'm going to ask you, if you had to open up a lemonade stand tomorrow, what would you call your lemonade stand?
That's pretty funny. When life gives you lemons.
That's a good one. I like that. So if you could take a class to learn anything, what would it be?
Learning how to meditate better, I think.
Okay. What eats up most of your time that you'd like to change?
Worrying.
Okay. What are you most excited about at work right now?
The relationships I'm building.
What was the first thing you wanted to be when you grew up?
I think a teacher. Which is kind of funny because it's come full circle now.
Full circle, yes. Let's see what else we got here. Who do you look to advice or mentorship?
Probably my dad. My dad was a physician, and then he was a big time chief medical officer in a big company. So he's usually the one I call when I'm needing some advice.
Okay. 2 more questions. What is the one thing that doesn't add value to your life, but you still do it?
Drink wine.
Okay. And last question, I ask everybody this question, either business or personal, doesn't matter to me. What is one subscription you cannot live without?
Netflix.
Another popular choice.
Yep.
Amazon, Netflix, Canvas, all these different choices.
Amazon's good too.
Yeah. So that's why I said business or personal. So,
yeah.
Okay. Well, Michelle, you are a great guest. How can people find more about what you or Connect The Dents can do? What's the best way for them to reach out to you or learn more about you?
Yeah, so you can reach out to me on my email. It's michelle.hedgecock@gmail.com. You can also find us on LinkedIn. Our website is Connect The Dents, for like Connect the Dentists. But we have more information on there, but I'm, available to chat on the phone. I really like to have a phone conversation and get to know people and figure out, where we can help them out.
So if you are in position that you are considering selling, you want to know, hey, when is the right time? You want to inquire about what your practice is valued at. You have an offer for them as well, correct?
Yes. So we are offering for the guests of Raving Patients podcast a $300 discount on our practice valuations. And one thing I wanted to throw out there is that when we do match you with a DSO or a DPO, you don't pay us anything. So the only thing you've paid for is the appraisal fee, and the buyer is going to cover our costs for finding you for them.
Gotcha. So they should just mention the Raving Patient podcast, and then they'll get $300 off the practice valuation. Perfect. Guys, if you are thinking about selling, want to know when you should sell, want to know what your practice is worth, definitely reach out to Tony and Michelle at Connect The Dents, and they will be able to definitely help you and assist you in looking at what your practice is worth, and if it's worth it for you to end up looking to sell to either a private practice like I did, a DSO, or a DPO. If you like the episode, please share it. Please recommend us. Please review us. All these things you can do for me, I would really appreciate it. Remember to thank our sponsors, both Dental Intelligence and the Doc Sites, and my event in September called Supercharge Your Dental Practice, September 27th and 28th at the Scott Resort and Spa. You can go to superchargeyourdentalpractice.com and use the code RAVING to save $100 on your registration fees. And as I always end my podcasts, remember, Your reputation matters. Until the next episode, Michelle, thank you so much for joining me, and we'll talk to everyone soon.
Thanks so much. Bye.